When the Mongol armies appeared on the horizon of a medieval city, they brought something far more devastating than siege engines and cavalry charges. They brought a weapon that moved faster than their horses, penetrated thicker walls than their arrows, and conquered territories before a single soldier crossed the border. This weapon was fear itself, systematically engineered and strategically deployed with the precision of a military campaign. The Mongols understood a fundamental truth that many of their contemporaries missed. The human mind, when properly manipulated, could surrender cities more efficiently than months of conventional siege warfare. The conventional wisdom of medieval warfare centered on fortifications and military strength. Cities invested enormous resources in building impregnable walls, towers, and moats. Armies measured their power in the number of soldiers, the quality of weapons, and the strength of cavalry units. Yet the Mongols recognized these physical defenses as secondary targets. Their primary objective was always the psychological fortress that existed in the minds of their enemies, the collective confidence, morale, and will to resist that held communities together in the face of invasion. This approach to warfare represented a revolutionary understanding of how conflicts are won and lost. While European and Middle Eastern commanders focused on tactical superiority on the battlefield, the Mongols engaged in what we might today call information warfare or psychological operations. They understood that every human decision, from a general's strategic choices to a common soldier's willingness to fight, originated in psychological factors: fear, hope, loyalty, and the assessment of survival chances. By attacking these mental foundations, the Mongols could cause enemy resistance to collapse from within, often before the actual military confrontation began. The genesis of this psychological warfare doctrine emerged from the Mongols' unique circumstances and the vision of Genghis Khan. Operating initially from the steppes of Mongolia, the Mongols faced a fundamental strategic challenge. They were numerically inferior to the vast sedentary civilizations they would eventually conquer. The population of Mongolia could never match the millions living in China, Persia, or Eastern Europe. Traditional attrition warfare would inevitably favor their more populous enemies. This demographic reality forced the Mongols to develop force multipliers that would allow them to punch far above their weight class. Genghis Khan's genius lay partly in recognizing that the perception of Mongol power could be more valuable than actual power itself. If enemies believed the Mongols were invincible, unstoppable, and merciless, they would make decisions based on that belief, decisions that would often lead to their own defeat. A city that surrendered without fighting would preserve Mongol strength for the next conquest. An army that fled at the eye-to-eye first sight of Mongol cavalry would create opportunities for devastating pursuit and encirclement. Populations that submitted peacefully would require fewer occupation forces and could even contribute to future campaigns. The implementation of this psychological strategy required sophisticated intelligence networks and communication systems. The Mongols invested heavily in gathering information about their target populations long before military operations began. Merchants, travelers, and spies would infiltrate regions marked for conquest, collecting data about political structures, economic conditions, military capabilities, and social tensions. This intelligence gathering served multiple purposes. It identified the most effective pressure points for psychological manipulation, revealed potential collaborators who could be recruited, and provided the raw material for the propaganda campaigns that would precede invasion. Communication speed became a critical advantage in the Mongols' psychological warfare. They developed one of history's most efficient postal and messaging systems, the YAM, which could relay information across vast distances with remarkable speed. This system allowed the Mongols to coordinate their terror campaigns across multiple fronts, ensuring that stories of Mongol conquests spread rapidly throughout target regions. A city destroyed in Persia became a cautionary tale in Russia within weeks, priming populations for submission before Mongol armies even approached their borders. The Mongols also understood the power of narrative and how stories shape collective behavior. They actively cultivated a mythology around their military prowess, divine mandate, and merciless treatment of resistors. These narratives weren't merely byproducts of their campaigns. They were carefully managed information operations designed to create specific psychological effects in target populations. The story of a city that resisted and was subsequently massacred would be amplified and embellished, ensuring that the next city would have to calculate whether resistance was worth the existential risk. This narrative management extended to how the Mongols presented themselves and their intentions. They positioned their conquests not as random acts of aggression, but as the inevitable fulfillment of heavenly decree. Genghis Khan claimed the mandate of the eternal blue sky to rule all lands, framing resistance not merely as futile, but as sacrilegious opposition to divine will. This framing added a metaphysical dimension to the psychological pressure, suggesting that submission was not just the practical choice, but the morally and cosmically correct one. The practical application of these psychological principles manifested in the Mongols' diplomatic practices before warfare. They would typically send envoys to cities and kingdoms with straightforward propositions: submit peacefully, acknowledge Mongol supremacy, provide tribute and soldiers, and your city will be integrated into the empire with minimal disruption. Resist and face total annihilation. These offers weren't genuine attempts at peaceful resolution. They were psychological operations designed to force target populations into an impossible mental calculation. The genius of this approach lay in its asymmetry. For the Mongols, both outcomes were acceptable and even advantageous. Peaceful submission achieved their strategic objectives without expenditure of military resources. Violent resistance, followed by the promised massacre, would reinforce the terror narrative and make subsequent conquests easier. The target population, however, faced an impossible dilemma: surrender and lose sovereignty and pride, or resist and potentially lose everything, including their lives. This psychological trap ensured that regardless of the choice made, the Mongols benefited. The implementation of psychological warfare by the Mongol armies relied on a systematic methodology that transformed abstract fear into concrete policy. This methodology encompassed several distinct but interconnected techniques, each designed to attack different aspects of enemy psychology and create cumulative effects that would paralyze resistance. The sophistication of these techniques suggests that the Mongols had developed, through experience and strategic thinking, an intuitive understanding of mass psychology that would not be formally articulated in academic terms for centuries. The first and most visible technique was the strategic use of extreme violence as a communication tool. When cities resisted Mongol demands, the subsequent punishment wasn't simply military conquest. It was theatrical demonstration designed for maximum psychological impact on witnesses and future targets. The massacres that followed resistance were conducted with methodical brutality that served specific strategic purposes. Every act of violence carried a message. This is what happens to those who defy us, and no one is safe from our reach. The scale of these demonstrations was deliberately chosen to overwhelm the human capacity for comprehension. Historical accounts, while potentially exaggerated by chroniclers seeking to emphasize the catastrophe, consistently describe death tolls in the hundreds of thousands for major cities. Whether these numbers were literally accurate matters less than their psychological effect. The Mongols ensured that survivors would spread stories of destruction so complete, so total, that future cities would struggle to imagine survival through resistance. When contemplating whether to fight or surrender, city leaders would recall these stories and recognize that the Mongols didn't engage in limited warfare. They practiced existential annihilation. The manner of killing was also strategically chosen. The Mongols didn't simply kill enemy soldiers. They systematically executed entire populations, often organizing the process with bureaucratic efficiency. Inhabitants would be divided into groups, marched outside city walls, and executed in organized fashion. This methodical approach served multiple purposes. It demonstrated that Mongol wrath wasn't hot-blooded rage, but cold calculation, suggesting that no last-minute plea or resistance would change the outcome. It also ensured maximum witness testimony, as the process took time and created numerous opportunities for observers to escape and spread the tale. Physical destruction complemented human casualties. Cities that resisted were often razed so completely that they ceased to exist as functional settlements. The Mongols would destroy irrigation systems, burn libraries, demolish architectural monuments, and sometimes even redirect rivers to flood ruined cities, ensuring they could never be rebuilt. This comprehensive destruction carried symbolic weight. It demonstrated that resistance didn't merely result in conquest and occupation, but in the erasure of cultural identity and historical continuity. Future generations would walk through rubble and remember the cost of defiance. However, the Mongol approach to psychological warfare wasn't uniformly destructive. They understood that terror alone, without hope of alternative outcomes, could potentially drive desperate populations to suicidal resistance. Therefore, they carefully calibrated their reputation to include both extreme punishment for resistance and generous treatment for submission. Cities that surrendered peacefully were often integrated into the empire, with their governance structures relatively intact, their populations protected, and their economic activities continued under Mongol supervision. This carrot-and-stick approach created a psychological framework that made submission seem not merely prudent, but potentially beneficial. The Mongols would publicize examples of cities that had prospered under their rule, highlighting the administrative efficiency, trade opportunities, and religious tolerance that characterized Mongol governance. Merchants who had traded safely along Mongol-controlled routes would spread stories of unprecedented security and commercial opportunity. These positive narratives weren't altruistic. They were strategic information operations designed to make surrender psychologically palatable. The timing of Mongol psychological operations demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how information affects decision-making under pressure. Mongol armies typically moved with remarkable speed, appearing at city gates sometimes weeks before defenders expected them. This rapid advance created time pressure that favored impulsive, fear-driven decisions over careful strategic planning. City councils, suddenly confronted with Mongol envoys demanding immediate submission, had to make existential choices without adequate time for consultation, preparation, or even psychological adjustment to the crisis. This time compression was often enhanced by simultaneous attacks on multiple targets. The Mongols would launch coordinated campaigns across broad fronts, creating an impression of overwhelming force and omnipresence. A kingdom facing Mongol invasion might receive news that 3 or 4 major cities were simultaneously under siege or had already fallen. This multiplied the psychological pressure, suggesting that resistance anywhere was futile because the Mongols possessed resources sufficient to overwhelm all defensive positions simultaneously. The reality might be more modest. Mongol forces were often smaller than believed, but the perception of vast strength achieved the strategic objective. Intelligence operations played a crucial role in targeting psychological vulnerabilities. The Mongols didn't approach all enemies with identical tactics. they adapted their psychological warfare to exploit specific weaknesses in each target society. Through their extensive spy networks, they identified internal conflicts, economic pressures, unpopular rulers, and social tensions that could be leveraged. A kingdom facing internal rebellion might find Mongol envoys offering to support that rebellion in exchange for submission. A city with merchant classes resentful of military aristocracy might hear Mongol promises of commercial prosperity and reduced taxation. This tailored approach maximized psychological impact by addressing the specific hopes and fears of different social groups within target populations. The Mongols recognized that societies weren't monolithic entities, but collections of competing interests. By offering different inducements to different groups, merchants, religious leaders, military commanders, common people, they could fracture the unified resistance that might otherwise emerge. A city council debating whether to resist might find its merchant representatives arguing for submission based on commercial interests, while military commanders pushed for resistance based on honor, creating paralysis through internal division. The use of collaborators and local auxiliaries further enhanced psychological warfare effectiveness. When Mongol armies conquered a region, they would often incorporate local forces into their military structure, particularly siege engineers and specialists familiar with local warfare techniques. These collaborators served multiple purposes. They provided military expertise, reduced the burden on Mongol manpower, and created devastating psychological effects on future targets. Cities facing invasion would discover that the armies besieging them included their own countrymen, neighbors, or even relatives fighting under Mongol command. This practice attacked the psychological foundations of resistance by demonstrating that survival and prosperity under Mongol rule were possible and even attractive. If entire populations could switch allegiance and fight for their former enemies, what did national loyalty or resistance mean? The presence of local collaborators also provided the Mongols with invaluable intelligence about defensive preparations, cultural vulnerabilities, and psychological pressure points. Former citizens knew exactly which arguments, threats, or promises would most effectively undermine their compatriots' will to fight. The Mongols also weaponized religious and cultural symbols in their psychological campaigns. Despite their shamanistic traditions, they displayed remarkable pragmatism toward religion, often enlisting religious leaders to legitimize their conquests or at least neutralize religious opposition. In Christian regions, they might present themselves as potential allies against Muslim expansion. In Muslim territories, they could emphasize their tolerance of Islam and protection of trade routes to Mecca. This religious flexibility wasn't spiritual, but strategic. It allowed them to co-opt powerful institutions that shaped popular opinion and moral frameworks. The psychological dominance that the Mongols achieved didn't emerge spontaneously from battlefield victories alone. It required a sophisticated infrastructure dedicated to gathering, processing, and disseminating information that would shape perceptions across continents. This infrastructure represented one of history's earliest examples of systematic information warfare, combining espionage, propaganda, diplomatic manipulation, and communication networks into an integrated system that operated continuously across the vast Mongol Empire and beyond its frontiers. At the foundation of this infrastructure lay the Mongol intelligence apparatus, which functioned with sophistication that rivaled modern espionage organizations. The Mongols maintained extensive networks of spies, informants, and agents who operated deep within target societies years before military operations commenced. These intelligence operatives came from diverse backgrounds: merchants who traveled trade routes and gathered commercial and political information, religious pilgrims who could move freely across borders, nomadic peoples who shared cultural affinities with the Mongols, and even disaffected members of target societies who could be recruited through promises of reward or revenge against their own governments. The information collected by these networks was remarkably comprehensive. Mongol commanders received detailed intelligence about military capabilities, including the size and quality of enemy armies, fortification designs, weapons technology, and tactical doctrines. They obtained economic data about agricultural productivity, trade patterns, tax revenues, and resource availability. Political intelligence revealed power structures, succession disputes, factional conflicts, and the personal characteristics of rulers and military commanders. Social information identified ethnic tensions, religious divisions, and popular grievances that could be exploited. This intelligence wasn't merely collected, it was systematically analyzed and integrated into strategic planning. The Mongols developed what we might today recognize as intelligence assessment processes, where information from multiple sources was correlated, verified, and synthesized into actionable insights. Before launching campaigns, Mongol commanders would possess comprehensive understanding of their targets' strengths, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities. This knowledge superiority provided enormous advantages in psychological warfare, allowing the Mongols to craft messages and threats precisely calibrated to exploit specific fears and divisions within target populations. The communication infrastructure that disseminated these psychological warfare operations represented a technological and organizational achievement that was unmatched in the medieval world. The YAM system, which functioned as an imperial postal and relay network, could transmit messages across the entire empire at speeds that contemporaries found almost supernatural. Relay stations positioned at regular intervals provided fresh horses and riders, allowing urgent communications to travel hundreds of miles per day. This communication velocity meant that psychological operations could be coordinated across vast distances, and that news of conquests could spread to future targets with strategic timing. The speed of Mongol communications created a psychological weapon in itself. Target populations discovered that news of Mongol victories reached them faster than seemed physically possible, creating an impression of omnipresence and supernatural capability. A city in Eastern Europe might learn about Mongol conquests in Persia within weeks, a communication speed that suggested either divine intervention or capabilities beyond normal human limitations. This perception enhanced the overall psychological impact of Mongol military operations, surrounding them with an aura of inevitability that undermined enemy morale before combat began. The Mongols also understood the importance of controlling narratives about their campaigns. They didn't merely allow stories to spread organically. They actively managed and amplified certain narratives while suppressing others. Tales of cities that resisted and were subsequently annihilated were encouraged and embellished, with Mongol agents ensuring these stories reached maximum audiences in target regions. Conversely, stories of Mongol defeats or setbacks were suppressed when possible, and when suppression failed, they were reframed as tactical withdrawals or strategic decisions rather than genuine military failures. This narrative management extended to the creation and dissemination of quasi-mythological stories about Mongol capabilities and origins. The Mongols cultivated legends about their invincibility, their supernatural origins under heaven's mandate, and the personal qualities of their leaders. Genghis Khan was presented not merely as a successful military commander, but as a figure of destiny, chosen by cosmic forces to unite the world under a single rule. These narratives operated at a deeper psychological level than simple military threats, tapping into religious and metaphysical beliefs that shaped how medieval populations understood power and legitimacy. The diplomatic infrastructure that the Mongols developed served psychological warfare objectives as effectively as it served traditional diplomatic functions. Mongol envoys weren't merely negotiators, they were psychological operatives trained to assess, manipulate, and intimidate. The typical Mongol diplomatic mission to a target city would involve multiple psychological tactics designed to create maximum pressure. Envoys would arrive with elaborate ceremonial displays emphasizing Mongol power and authority. They would deliver ultimatums in terms that left no room for face-saving compromise, forcing target populations to choose between total submission and total war. These diplomatic missions were carefully choreographed to create specific psychological effects. Envoys would often present detailed knowledge about the target city's defenses, leadership, and internal politics, demonstrating that the Mongols possessed comprehensive intelligence and that resistance based on secrecy or surprise was impossible. They would reference recent Mongol victories and describe in vivid detail the fate of cities that had chosen resistance. They would offer terms that appeared generous compared to the alternative of annihilation, but which nonetheless demanded complete political subordination and material tribute. The physical appearance and behavior of Mongol envoys contributed to psychological impact. They typically presented themselves with confidence bordering on arrogance, communicating through body language and demeanor that they represented an irresistible force. Their willingness to deliver threatening ultimatums, even when vastly outnumbered by the populations they addressed, demonstrated either remarkable courage or absolute confidence in their backers' power. Either interpretation served Mongol psychological objectives. The envoys' apparent indifference to threats against their own persons suggested they served a power so great that individual survival was secondary to their mission. The treatment of envoys by target populations became another psychological warfare tool. The Mongols established an absolute principle: harm to Mongol envoys would result in merciless retaliation. When the Khwarezmian Shah executed Mongol ambassadors in 1218, Genghis Khan launched a campaign of such comprehensive destruction that it became legendary across Asia and Europe. This response wasn't merely revenge, it was strategic communication, establishing that violating diplomatic protocols would result in consequences far exceeding the original offense. Future rulers, aware of this precedent, faced terrible choices when confronted with Mongol envoys delivering intolerable demands: submit to humiliation or risk existential destruction. The economic infrastructure of the Mongol Empire also served psychological warfare purposes. The Mongols recognized that economic connectivity created dependencies that could be leveraged for political control. By establishing and securing trade routes across their empire, they created commercial opportunities that made peaceful integration attractive to merchant classes in target societies. Cities that submitted peacefully found themselves connected to vast trading networks stretching from China to Europe, bringing unprecedented prosperity. These success stories were actively promoted to future targets, making surrender seem economically rational. Conversely, the Mongols could weaponize economic access by threatening exclusion. Cities that resisted might find themselves cut off from trade routes, isolated economically as well as militarily. The psychological impact of watching neighboring cities prosper through Mongol connections while facing economic stagnation created powerful incentives for submission. This economic pressure operated continuously, even during peacetime, creating ongoing psychological reinforcement of Mongol dominance. The administrative infrastructure that governed conquered territories was designed to minimize resistance and maximize collaboration. The Mongols typically allowed considerable local autonomy in matters of religion, culture, and daily governance, requiring only political loyalty, military support, and tribute. This relatively light administrative touch made Mongol rule less psychologically onerous than many alternatives. Populations discovered that life under Mongol sovereignty wasn't the horror they had imagined, but a manageable arrangement that preserved most aspects of normal existence. The long-term effectiveness of Mongol psychological warfare extended far beyond individual military campaigns, creating lasting effects that shaped the political and cultural landscape of Eurasia for generations. The infrastructure of fear that the Mongols constructed didn't dissolve when armies departed or when the empire eventually fragmented. Instead, it became embedded in collective memory, influencing how societies understood power, resistance, and survival. The psychological conquest that the Mongols achieved proved more durable than their territorial conquests, persisting in chronicles, folklore, and strategic thinking long after the empire itself had ceased to exist. The immediate effectiveness of these psychological tactics manifested in the remarkable speed and scope of Mongol conquests. Between 1206, when Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes, and the mid-13th century, the Mongols conquered more territory than any empire in history had acquired in a comparable time frame. This achievement becomes even more remarkable when considering the relatively modest population base from which Mongol armies drew their manpower. Estimates suggest that at its peak, the entire Mongol military might have numbered only a few 100,000 soldiers, a force that, conventional military analysis would consider inadequate for conquering and occupying territories spanning from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to Vietnam. The explanation for this disparity between resources and achievements lies precisely in the effectiveness of psychological warfare. By attacking mines before walls, the Mongols reduced the actual fighting required to achieve strategic objectives. A significant percentage of cities and regions submitted without battle, preserving Mongol military strength for the next campaign. When battles occurred, enemies often fought with diminished morale, having internalized narratives of Mongol invincibility that became self-fulfilling prophecies. Defenders who believed defeat was inevitable often fought half-heartedly or sought opportunities to surrender, while those who fought desperately did so with the desperation of men already certain of their doom, a psychological state that rarely produces effective military resistance. The economic efficiency of psychological warfare provided the Mongols with strategic advantages that compounded over time. Conventional siege warfare could consume enormous resources and time. Medieval sieges sometimes lasted months or years, requiring besieging armies to maintain supply lines, construct siege equipment, and sustain forces in the field through multiple seasons. The defenders, protected by fortifications, often had advantages in these contests of attrition. The Mongols, by inducing surrenders through psychological pressure, avoided these costs while simultaneously preserving the economic value of conquered territories. Cities that surrendered intact could immediately begin contributing taxes, soldiers, and resources to subsequent campaigns. This economic calculation created a virtuous cycle for Mongol expansion. Each successful psychological conquest provided resources for the next campaign while reinforcing the terror narratives that made future conquests easier. As the empire grew, its reputation grew proportionally, making each successive target more intimidated than the last. The Mongols effectively leveraged their conquests into multiplying returns, where success bred the reputation that enabled further success. This dynamic helps explain the accelerating pace of Mongol expansion during its peak period. Later conquests came faster and easier than earlier ones because the psychological infrastructure had been thoroughly established. However, the Mongol psychological warfare system contained inherent limitations and vulnerabilities that eventually contributed to the empire's fragmentation and decline. The terror-based reputation that facilitated conquests created enduring enmity that made genuine integration difficult. Populations might submit out of fear, But fear alone proved insufficient for building lasting loyalty or cultural cohesion. As Mongol military pressure waned or attention shifted elsewhere, subjected populations often rebelled when opportunities arose. The psychological wounds inflicted during conquest created collective traumas that persisted across generations, ensuring that Mongol rule remained fundamentally alien and resented even when administratively competent. The strategy also depended heavily on maintaining the perception of invincibility. This perception was constructed through careful narrative management, but it remained vulnerable to contradictory evidence. When Mongol armies suffered defeats, as they eventually did in Japan, Southeast Asia, and at Ain Jalut against the Mamluks, these defeats undermined the psychological foundations of their power. News of Mongol vulnerability spread as quickly as earlier stories of invincibility had traveled, emboldening resistance movements and forcing the Mongols to rely more heavily on conventional military occupation. The psychological weapon that had enabled their conquests gradually lost its edge through overuse and contrary evidence. The fragmentation of the Mongol Empire into competing khanates further eroded the psychological warfare system's effectiveness. The terror and awe inspired by a unified Mongol Empire commanded by descendants of Genghis Khan couldn't be sustained when Mongol rulers fought among themselves. The sight of Mongol armies battling each other demonstrated that they weren't the unstoppable, unified force that propaganda had portrayed. Subject populations recognized opportunities to play competing khanates against each other, to seek autonomy or independence during moments of Mongol weakness, and to reconstruct the regional power structures that Mongol conquests had disrupted. Yet the legacy of Mongol psychological warfare extended far beyond the empire's political lifespan. The techniques and principles they developed influenced military and political thinking across Eurasia. Successor states and rival powers studied Mongol methods and adapted them to their own contexts. The understanding that perception, reputation, and psychological manipulation could serve as force multipliers became embedded in strategic thinking. The Mongol example demonstrated that military power wasn't merely about soldiers and weapons, but about how that power was perceived, communicated, and leveraged to influence enemy decision-making. The historical memory of Mongol conquests shaped political consciousness in conquered regions for centuries. In Russia, China, Persia, and Central Asia, the Mongol yoke, or Tatar yoke, became fundamental reference points in national narratives. These collective memories influenced how societies understood threats, power, and resistance. The trauma of Mongol conquest became foundational to cultural identities, often serving as examples of existential threats that required eternal vigilance. Ironically, this enduring psychological impact represented perhaps the ultimate success of Mongol psychological warfare. Their conquests remained psychologically present long after their political presence had vanished. Modern military theorists and strategists have recognized the Mongol approach as an early example of principles that would later be formalized in concepts like psychological operations, information warfare, and strategic communications. The Mongol understanding that warfare encompasses not just physical combat, but competition for psychological dominance anticipated theoretical frameworks that wouldn't be fully developed until the 20th century. Their integration of intelligence gathering, propaganda, terror tactics, and diplomatic manipulation into comprehensive psychological campaigns provided historical precedent for modern approaches to warfare that emphasize information superiority and cognitive domain operations. The ethical questions raised by Mongol psychological warfare remain relevant to contemporary debates about military ethics and the laws of war. The deliberate use of terror, the targeting of civilian populations, and the instrumental use of massacre as communication tools violated principles that most modern societies consider fundamental to just warfare. Yet the Mongols' success raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between ethical conduct and strategic effectiveness. They demonstrated that methods considered barbaric could achieve remarkable strategic results, challenging assumptions about whether moral constraints serve practical interests or conflict with them. The Mongol example also illuminates the relationship between military innovation and cultural context. The psychological warfare techniques they developed emerged from their specific circumstances. Nomadic societies operating from resource-poor regions, facing more populous and wealthier sedentary civilizations. Their innovative approach to warfare represented adaptation to strategic challenges that conventional methods couldn't overcome. This suggests that military innovation often emerges from necessity, from actors who must develop asymmetric advantages to compete with stronger conventional powers. The information infrastructure that supported Mongol psychological warfare anticipated technologies and organizational structures that would become central to modern governance and military operations. Their postal system, intelligence networks, and communication protocols demonstrated that information could be systematically collected, transmitted, and weaponized. The speed and scope of their information operations, remarkable for the medieval period, established precedents that later empires would emulate and expand. The recognition that controlling information flows provided strategic advantages became a fundamental principle of statecraft that remains central to contemporary geopolitics. In conclusion, the Mongol strategy of attacking mines before walls represented a sophisticated understanding of how human psychology influences military outcomes. By investing in psychological warfare infrastructure, the Mongols transformed their demographic and resource disadvantages into strategic advantages. They recognized that walls could be bypassed, armies could be avoided, and territories could be conquered if the psychological foundations of resistance could be undermined. Their systematic approach to fear, reputation, and perception created force multipliers that enabled conquest on an unprecedented scale. The techniques they developed, strategic use of terror, narrative management, intelligence operations, diplomatic manipulation, and coordinated psychological campaigns, established frameworks that influenced military thinking for centuries. While the ethical implications of their methods remain deeply troubling, their effectiveness cannot be denied. The Mongols demonstrated that warfare extends beyond physical battlefields into the cognitive domain, where perceptions, beliefs, and psychological states determine outcomes as significantly as weapons and fortifications. This insight, developed through pragmatic experience on the steppes and battlefields of Eurasia, represents one of history's most important lessons about the nature of power and conflict. The walls that seemed impregnable fell not because Mongol armies were strong enough to breach them, but because the minds defending those walls had already surrendered to fear.